There are moments of huge peril in it that I felt gave me a tight chest, you know, and that only happens because you engage with the story. If you engage with the story, then you can take it as far comedic and as far dramatic as you like.
It's rare that you read a script and it actually makes you laugh out loud, but it did, and so instantly I was like, this is something I want to be a part of for that reason.
And actually he did, there were certain things, you know, I think he flew to Australia and then he decided to quickly go to Copenhagen to have a little tryst with Sheila, and then flew back. I mean, it was sort of more absurd.
Two of us.
It's just a few details to iron out.
15 charges of forgery, theft and fraud.
You thought you could have it all, didn't you, John?
Just starting out, really loved the series. It is hilarious. It's a story that obviously I had never heard of before, but at the end of it, I couldn't help but digging in and trying to learn as much as I could, because it's just a completely incredulous story that this happened. But Kevin, I want to start with you and ask you, what was it like playing the same character for a second time? And did you have a different approach in playing him this time?
Yes, I mean, the first time I played him in Legend, it was a very singular couple of scenes in which I was just very frustrated. What was lovely about coming back to him in this was that I've been given a nice story arc about you know, Harold's rise and decline, which is really nice to have in a supporting character. But I also, it wasn't just the second time, because I used to play him to my mates at school. I used to impersonate him, but it was really, I was so thrilled when Ruth Kennedy mentioned to me last year that she was doing this project and she thought I could maybe play Wilson, and so and I'm really pleased about the way it's come out, because I have to say, when I saw the first episode and now have watched the whole thing, I think it is the ultimate in entertainment. It's an amazing story that's about humanity, is bloody funny, and is terribly sad at times as well. And I don't think you can get better than that from the drama.
Absolutely. And Matthew, playing this character, it's exactly that. It's both tragic and hilarious at the same time. And there's so many moments along the way where I couldn't believe the direction that this story went. How familiar were you with Stonehouse before taking on this role?
I didn't know anything about it. So it was a treat to read. Fascinating.
This is not the first
if
time.
I may say that before you ask the next question, for the gainsayers who say that, you know, because the Crown's come in for a lot of criticism for this. For the gainsayers, I actually was asked, and I was delighted to do the narration for an actual documentary called The Real Stonehouse, which goes with the show. And I would urge people to watch it, because you'll see that we aren't taking many liberties. There are some little shuffles you have to make scenes work, but it's all there in the real story.
Yeah, and actually there were certain things, you know, I think he flew to Australia and then he decided to quickly go to Copenhagen to have a little tryst with Sheila, and then flew back. I mean, it was sort of more absurd. So bits we left out, you know, just for sort of storytelling. One of the great things that we left out, just because you've got 3 hours to do the story, is that he didn't want to leave Australia, but when he found out he was going to be thrown out of the House of Commons, he wanted to go back because he didn't want to lose himself as an MP, which, given that he was making a new life in Australia, is beyond absurd. It's beyond absurd, and it's truly what he did. Yeah, and apparently when he swam into the sea in Miami, he'd left his clothes and his passport nicely displayed on top of his clothes. He swam into the sea and swam along the bay a bit, and then came out, and then sort of wandered back to check whether anyone had noticed. Made it a bit more prominent, and then sort of went off again. I mean, it was just ridiculous. And it's such a crazy story, but you got to do this, and not the first time acting with your wife, but playing a married couple, but such a dysfunctional story. Did the two of you have a lot of fun doing that? Such a lot of fun. Yeah. Often it's the more sort of heightened and the more different it is from your real life, the more fun it, you know. And Keely's a brilliant actress, and the scenes are great. So we just had a shorthand anyway, you know. And so it was just lovely.
Another one. What are you doing?
Unfortunately, I have to go away.
So this is a great series. Absolutely loved it. And it is just so bizarre and incredulous that this story even happened in real life. How familiar were you with the story before taking on this part?
Not familiar at all. I'd never heard of Stonehouse. So I was amazed that I'd never heard of it, but also that it happened. Yeah, so it was all a learning experience for me.
How did you find this character? Was it all on the script? Did you do any research? How did you prepare for this role?
I mean, John Preston's script was so just bursting with life. So I really got a sense of the tone and where he wanted to take all of the characters. I did read about the story myself, mainly just out of interest and to see the kind of context surrounding it. But I think John's kind of version of Sheila was so appealing. So it was mainly what he gave me there that I worked with.
And Sheila she's a very interesting character because from beginning to end, she goes from seeming very naive and very wholesome to questioning how involved was she in this. What did you take as the biggest character trait for her? Like, what did you view her as a person?
Yeah, so it was a really fun one to play because of that kind of contradictory element that she has. And I think from the off, Jon Baird, our director, was really keen to constantly play with that and always have that sense of innocence and naivety, but also the kind of steely grit that she has. So I think that was the main driver throughout, was in every scene, how much does she know? How much is she controlling the situation and using all of her kind of innocence to her advantage in a way?
And it's such a funny and yet dramatic at the same time. Like, there's moments where it's played so seriously, but I couldn't help but just laughing at the fact that this is even happening. Was that something that you found reading it on the page? Was it already funny reading it there?
Oh, definitely. And it's rare that you read a script and it actually makes you laugh out loud, but it did. And so instantly I was like, this is something I want to be a part of for that reason. And then, once it got into the hands of Matthew and Keely and Kevin and Dorothy Atkinson, it was just watching those characters come to life was incredible.
And you work with such a great cast. There's so many amazing performers in this cast. Who was the person that you you interact a lot with Matthew, obviously, but who did you interact with or act opposite that really kind of was an amazing experience for you out of this whole production?
Well, I think I shared, the majority of my scenes with Matthew, and then obviously have these amazing set pieces with both him and Keely. And I think getting the double act of this incredible pair of actors who are also married was such a fun dynamic to be part of, and I learned so much from that, from shooting those scenes.
And there's one scene in particular, I think it's when it's in the first episode when he's going to be going on camera, and Sheila is introduced for the first time, and there's just this moment of silence, and then he kind of leaves the two of you alone. It's such a fun dynamic. Was that something, did you have to do a lot of prep with them before you started shooting, or did that just kind of come about naturally?
I think it just kind of, it's so clear in the script what is to be done with that scene. And then Jon Baird has such a clear image of how he wants it to look. And then Keely can just eviscerate you with one stare. So I was in very safe hands, and I wasn't doing much acting when she gives me that hard glare.
And have you seen the finished production since it's been finished?
I have, I've been lucky enough to watch all 3 episodes, and it's oddly kind of exactly how I imagined, because it was so clear when we were filming it, in the kind of tone. It's amazing to watch it come to life properly.
And capturing the era, kind of, going back, obviously the production values are fantastic, and you have to put on all the costumes and everything. What was it like slipping into that different era?
Oh, just a treat. I personally, as an actor, love kind of stepping away from my norm. So, getting to wear all these incredible costumes. I mean, Guy, the costume designer, and Julie, the makeup designer, they just, they gave us half of our character already. Like, you don't have to do that much work when you've got all this incredible stuff to work with. So, yeah, I loved it. I didn't want to give my costumes back at the end.
Awesome. Well, you're phenomenal in the show. I really loved it. I can't wait for everybody to check it out. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks so much.
Swimmer. You let us believe that you were dead.
You see, we have reason to suppose that this isn't your real name.
We thought we were going to be together. The two of us.
It's just a few details to iron out.
And you've gotten so much exposure recently because of Succession, and there's some parallels between the two characters that they have this desire to move up, and they are sometimes in over their heads. Do you think that, did you draw any comparisons yourself between the two performances?
No.
Totally different?
Totally. I mean, couldn't be. I mean, there is a sort of, I guess there are similarity, in their desire to sort of be near power and, work their way up the pole of, but no, I wasn't thinking about Tom Wambsgans.
Were you thinking, and there's obviously parallels politically in what's going on today politically to the insanity here, and there's so many politicians today that we can't believe that they don't lose their jobs and they continue to do what they're doing. Was that something that influenced your performance at all here?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, Kevin, you were very interesting about maybe that's the sort of, at that time was sort of the beginning of that. Politics changed from being something which was, as you said, patrician and sort of old and happened behind closed doors, and, people just got on with it in a sort of sober, unshowy way. And now, inevitably, it's become about, the presentation, rather, the personality and the presentation rather than sort of old-fashioned, quiet competence.
And Kevin, you have a line, I think.
Sorry, I certainly think when you say, over here, meaning America, and certainly disastrous politics over here. But remember also this came about at a time that I think in England was one of the most successful periods in post-war, when we rebuilt the country and we created the National Health Service and we had a rail system, and there was a real sense that the government worked for the people. It's maybe around the time of Stonehouse when that ideal was lost, and of course it would be FDR in America.
Yes, and there's a moment I think very telling, Kevin, that you give, and I think it's at the beginning of the second episode, more concerned about, well, we can't get rid of him because then we'll lose our majority, and that's kind of a very telling political line there. Beyond that, though, and for either one of you, when you were looking at this script, when you were reading it, before even embodying these characters, were you reading this as a comedy, or were you reading this more as a dramatic story?
It's a funny read, but it's also very real and quite touching and moving and sad at points. I mean, he leaves his wife and children. It's a sort of drastic, destructive thing to do, but also sort of so it's a bit of everything, but I didn't sort of break it into it. I didn't think, but it felt like the style of it felt like a sort of caper. It's John writes these wonderful, quite small, perfectly contained scenes, so it sort of swings along. It has a great rhythm, I'd say. Sorry,
Matthew, but to add to that, in watching it as a viewer, yes, it has funny moments, but if ever you've been through any sort of hardship or difficulty, the moment when John is sitting there with his checkbooks, thinking that organizing them might make the problem go away.
Yes.
It's like, what a pressure he must be under. What is he doing? What does he think this will do? It's a wonderful moment. And there are moments of huge peril in it that I felt gave me a tight chest, and that only happens because you engage with the story. If you engage with the story, then you can take it as far comedic and as far dramatic as you like, but only if you've got the audience.
Absolutely true. And I think, Matthew, there's like two parts in this series that kind of perfectly encapsulate the entire series for me. And the first is you play the worst spy ever imaginable at the beginning there, like
I was all right.
Well, you were great, but it's like you can't believe, it's like, oh yeah, but I tell you all about airplanes that have already been on the news and that.
Dreadful.
And then the very next, trying to steal an identity and then finding out that the person never had a passport, and just like the look of dejection on your face in that scene, and that just kind of, it is both hilarious and tragic, but I loved every minute of it. You're both fantastic in it. Can't wait for people to check it out. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Who's banging on the door?
John Stonehouse.
Oh, yes, Stonehouse.
First rung on the ladder.
Who knows where it will lead?
So, great series. Absolutely loved it. It was so interesting because stateside, this is not a story I was very familiar with. And going into it, I don't know if I was prepared for just how insane this entire story gets. Like, it's incredulous how it goes from where it starts at the beginning and he's rising in the ranks to this complete debacle politically. And, you know, Mr. Preston, we'll start with you. How familiar were you with this story before you started adapting it?
I was quite familiar with it, but that said, I mean, I remember at the time, and I was I can't remember how old I was, but not that old. And it was probably one of the first instances where I was very much brought up to believe that, you know, that our government, whatever party, they were generally kind of dignified people, and you know, they knew what they were doing. So it was the first kind of indication that was hopelessly wide of the mark. And then when I went back into researching Stonehouse again, I don't think I'd ever known that I knew he went to Australia, but I hadn't realised that the only reason he was caught was because the Australian police thought he was Lord Lucan. And I remember when I read that, just going, whoa, okay, I've got to do this. You know, it was just, you know, because again, it's that very rare occasion when real life does sometimes serve up something which is just kind of perfect, really. You don't need to do very much with it at all.
And from a directorial standpoint, was this something, I mean, it's a period piece, it's set in a very specific era, you know, politically as well as visually. Was it difficult to achieve like that realistic look of traveling back in time several decades to make this look the way that it did?
It's no more difficult than anything else I have done in terms of that, because you know you're obviously starting with John's great script, and you know you're not creating a different world. You're kind of heightening a world, and I think that was the fun thing. I always look for projects that have a, you know, element of comedy, and you can push that comedy and you can heighten it through color palettes or camera choices or production design or whatever. But you have to hire a good team, you know, you have to hire people who can do their jobs. And we were very diligent about getting the right, you know, my costume designer I've worked with, you know, from the very beginning on everything I've done. So he was always got to be involved. But there's a lot of new people came on board with this, and I think it's just important when you're starting out like that, is you have to have everybody, regardless of their experience. You know, I would far rather take a less experienced person who bought into what we were trying to do and who understood the tone and everything, and get them involved. And we did that with this. We gave people a chance, you know. And that's the thing. It's no different from being like a sports manager, a director, you know, of a soccer team or whatever. You got to pick the right players for the right games or for the right positions and stuff. And to bring something to life off the page. You're not an island. You have this team, but the skill is getting the right team, you know. And we got a really good one on this. Going back to you made a comment about the comedy. A lot of times when historical stories like this, politically based stories are told, especially when they're true, there's an angle towards making them more dramatic and more serious. This, I mean, it's laughable what happened in this story, but was it intentional to really make this as funny as it was? Like, was it the goal to make this more comedic? I think it was definitely, you know, when you read John's script and when you look at John's previous work and stuff, you know that there's definitely an element of comedy in there, and a very sort of sophisticated element of comedy in there. I think what happens is, as a director, when you get that script, when you get the actors and stuff, you have to decide how much you want to push that comedy, yeah? And I think we were having such a blast making this show. You know, you've got somebody like Matthew Macfadyen, you know, who's really is a comedic genius. Yeah, he really is. I mean, there's very few out there that can do this kind of comedy like he can. And I think like just making sure that all the cast that came in were on the same level, on the same sort of page in terms of how. But I think as time went on, and even when we got in the edit and we realised how funny it was, then when the music started to get pushed in, and the music brings a heck of a lot of comedy to this as well, you know. So we were pushing it each time and seeing how far we could push it, you know. But we always obviously needed that emotional part as well, because as the show goes on and you get into this episode 3, it does become more emotional, and by the time the end, you know, the golden ticket at the end is you can make people cry, or certainly feel some emotion at the end to, you know, for this character, regardless of how absurd he is and the dastardly deeds he's got up to. So, but yeah, I really love pushing it to see how far we can go with it, you know. But that's not possible without Jon's, you know, his script and his tone, you know.
And Jon, back to your script, in the writing and the conception of this story, did you envision anybody in the cast that advanced? It's probably not fair from a writing standpoint if you did picture anybody, but did the actors kind of fit what you were envisioning on the page?
Well, I was, as far as I remember, when I found out that Matthew and Keeley were going to be doing it, I went back over what I'd done and not massively rewrote it, but I think I knew that it would be, because they'd been married, they obviously know one another terribly well, and I just thought you get such a kind of fascinating dynamic with a real life husband and wife playing a husband and wife on screen, and they both got such fantastic timing, so you could have a lot of fun with unspoken things. So I didn't actually conceive it with Matthew and Keeley in mind, but I did kind of retrospectively kind of tinker a bit once I knew they were doing it.
And when you were writing it, now, you know, in the contemporary landscape politically of where things are globally, was that a lens that changed the way that you approach this, keeping in mind where things are at in politics today?
Yeah, very much so, because I think that, I mean, the 1970s in the UK, politically, was a period of almost unbroken crises and drama and whatever. And in an odd kind of manner, Stonehouse was a rather emblematic figure of the kind of derangement of the times. And the times that we're living through at the moment, particularly in the UK, are not in any way dissimilar. So I did feel that there was kind of, you know, whatever it is, symbiosis between then and now.
And, you know, I just have to say that the series, it caught me off guard, and I think this is a testament to the work, though, from a writing standpoint and directing standpoint, what was done here, in that I watched it, and I watched all 3 in succession just because it was so entrancing. I loved watching it, and then afterwards I went to look up as much information I could about what really happened to try and see, did this really happen? So, you know, I really appreciate the work that you both did. It is excellent. I can't wait for people to check it out. And thank you so much for your time.
No, thank you very much indeed. Thanks.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
it.